Today I will be discussing the concept of moral panics. Moral panics are nothing new. They've been around since the birth of society, and they've often been used to influence society's behaviour and views. But what is a moral panic? Well, the word moral suggests some kind of a threat to society's ethics and well-being, and the word panic suggests an exaggerated or over-the-top response. Now we put these two words together and we have the definition that Stanley Cohen, who was a sociologist who studied social disturbances caused by what he called folk devils. So he defines moral panic as the reaction of society to something that is perceived as a threat to its values and morals, and the urge that is then felt to do something about it. So another scholar by the name of E. Good also writes that moral panics are felt to represent a crisis for that society, and they can either be introduced or they can enter the spotlight after a period of ongoing concern. Now I'll be using the example of violence in video games to try and illustrate what a moral panic is, and I'll be focusing on the whole Columbine High School massacre incident. So Stanley Cohen came up with 5 agents which are involved in a moral panic, and the first of these is folk devils. So these are the people who cause the panic. So Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the killers in the massacre, would be considered the folk devils in this example. The second agent is the rule enforcers. So these are like the police and the people who try to influence law that to try and target the problem. And the third agent would be the media, so anyone who works for the media, like the journalists and reporters who documented the whole incident of the massacre. The fourth agent would be the politicians, so this could be like the local Colorado government or the US government. And the fifth agent is the public, so basically just the ordinary citizens like you and me. So Cohen also came up with 5 characteristic stages that are involved in a moral panic. So the first of these is what I call the discovery stage, and that's when something is identified or perceived as a threat to the moral fibers of society. So in this case, this would be the violence in the video games or the people who play the violent video games. So the second stage is when the threat is made known, and in this day and age, the mass media is used to intensify the threat and to communicate the imminent danger that the threat poses. So, leading up to, it's been an ongoing issue, violent video games. The incident reports were released about the correlation between aggression in players of violent video games and the degree of violence in the video games. So yeah, media and science kind of worked together to create a public concern, which leads us to the third phase, and that's the eruption stage. That's what I call it. So this is when the public concern peaks, and there is a general consensus that something needs to be done to target the threat, to handle it. So after the shootings, it was found that the 2 school students who shot the students, they were fans of the first-person shooter game Doom, and so comparisons were made between the similarities of the game and the incident itself, and this fueled a public concern for the influence of violence in video games. Now this leads us to our fourth phase, which I call the response. So this is when the public outcry leads to a response by authorities or anyone with influence over the public. This is often an overreaction, and it's often more drastic than necessary. For example, the schools across the United States increased their school security and hired more police and security guards to be stationed at their school following the high school shooting incident. And they also installed more security cameras and metal detectors, and while this could be viewed as an overreaction by some, it could also be an underreaction, because we've still had shootings since 1999, which is when the massacre occurred. And anyway, this leads us to our fifth stage. That's the overall outcome of the moral panic. So we have to ask the question, did the moral panic lead to some kind of social change, or did it just die down? Well, in the case of the Columbine shootings, it kind of led to both. So due to the public hysteria, there were various attempts to control the problem of violent video games, including several unsuccessful lawsuits against game manufacturers by the victims' parents. Even before that, in 1994, following a controversy over Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, which are two violent video games, there was the classification scheme was introduced. And yeah, various protests and social movements have been happening to try and crack down on gun laws. And there's also been studies conducted on violent video games which fuel aggression. However, since the initial shock of the Columbine shootings, moral panic over violent video games has sizzled down, and mostly, but it has resurfaced from time to time following various other shootings. But the Columbine shootings are considered one of the worst school massacres in history, and while moral panics come and go, it's no matter how much we censor or classify games, we can't stop the fact that graphics are improving and violence is still there's still violent games out there. So the moral panic over violent video games may never completely subside.